All right, so it's a real pleasure to introduce Elke Krasny, who is professor at the Academy of Fine Arts here in Vienna. She's a cultural theorist, best known, I think, for theories about the urban. She holds a PhD from the University of Reading, and she is right now in the last, I think, preparations for a show at the Architekturmuseum, which is called Care and Repair, curated with Angelika Fitz, the director of the Architekturmuseum, which will open when? April 24th, 2019. She wrote a lot of texts, a lot of books, and we have been in contact for a couple of years now, I think, because Elke's thought about, like, really radical rethinking, I guess, of the idea of urban structuring and who should be considered part of the agenda of urban restructuring and how we need to think about the urban environment in the age of the so-called Anthropocene. Not sure how you think about the term itself, is, I think, extremely important. And so without further ado, please help me welcome Elke to the podium.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. As Mechthild was saying, we have been in conversation on questions about art, architecture, and urbanism for a number of years, particularly also because of the fact that Mechthild is one of the few people who works precisely at this intersection, both on contemporary art making, but also on questions of architecture. And even though one might think that this is very common because art and architecture do have shared conflict zones or shared territories or shared interests, and I started with the conflicts maybe tellingly, I think it's also rare that scholarship really addresses both. So I want to thank you for bringing people together here who speak on the question of site and territory, both from artistic research, art historical understanding, but also architecture and urbanism. And so I will try to put this in. Okay. And I put this drink here as a reminder for you that there is this wonderful non-alcoholic drink, which I almost drank all of it, and I recommend getting one. Territory of Care, a planetary perspective in architecture and urbanism. The talk I have prepared comes in 3 parts. I will introduce what I understand by territory of care. Then I will move on to reflect in more theoretical terms what care is and what it means for architecture and urbanism. And the last part is about the curatorial project that I'm working on together with Angelika Fitz, who is the director of the Architecture Center here in Vienna. I'm starting with the word habitat. So habitat means the territory, or we could also say the site where someone is living. And this someone could be a human being, and then the habitat is housing. But habitat is also very much used as a term in environmental studies or in biology, and it can refer to the place of site of living for other types of species. But we can also think in a larger scale. So as humans and non-humans, we inhabit this planet called Earth. So also the planet is a habitat. And when I think about the territory of care, I think about the habitat both in terms of housing, but also in terms of the planetary perspective that allows for humans and non-humans to have a home. The first image talks about what I just said, that it's about housing for humans. And the second image, and one could have chosen any kind of image to invoke this period that we are finding ourselves in, that is referred to as Anthropocene or Capitalocene or Cthulhucene, and by some people like Johanna Böhner and others also Ecocene, who suggest a more hopeful term that we might overcome the impact of the anthropos on the human humans on the habitat. Saskia Sassen, amongst many others, she's a sociologist, is speaking, lecturing, writing about the fact that our planet is in not a very good condition. So the condition of the planet is one that is extremely worrisome. And an etymological root of care also leads to the term care, which actually means worry. So we have to understand that we have to be worried or worrying about the state of our planet. And she very much shares this feeling of why we have to worry. One lecture she gave at Republika Berlin is titled Dead Land, Dead Water, on loss of habitat and new migrations. This is the image she used to illustrate the lecture. That's also what you see when you go online. And I think it's very interesting that a lot of the images that show the toxicity of the planet are actually very beautiful images. I mean, when we look at them, when we see the toxicity of the ocean, at first glance, we cannot capture or learn from the image that this is actually utmost toxicity and something that puts us all at risk. I'm quoting from Sassen. The expansion of mining, the expansion of land grabs, the expansion of cities, all of these processes have the capacity to force people off their land. People who may have been on that land for centuries, but they don't have the papers, they don't have the instruments to show that this is my land. So they can be thrown out. The estimate is that every year up to 3 million people are displaced in this manner. The estimate right now is that over 300 million hectares of land have been bought since 2008. Again, think, the big picture here is loss of habitat. So she addresses that there is a lot of neo-colonial buying up of land that takes away that land from either agricultural use or the possibility of remaining with the people who live there and have their habitat there. She doesn't really speak about environmental refugees here, so we would have to add that to the list so that it's not only the expansion of mining, land grabs, and expansion of cities, but also the expansion that leads to the exhaustion of resources and the taking away of the atmosphere. As you all know, there are many different bodies that are concerned with making political change in the climate change. And more recently also there have been a lot of voices who argue that since there's political deadlock, we should actually trust the market more, so that there should be more eco-investment. It's not my argument, but I'm sharing it here with you because I find it very interesting that when politics fail, what is it that we can actually turn to make positive change? So this image shows the United Nations Climate Change Conference 2015 that was held in Paris. And you are all aware, you followed this. I'm just invoking two images here. So one that shows all the mostly men who are dedicating their political agendas to not or maybe yes changing the climate. And then on the other hand, which is also very much part of the climate in a more metaphorical sense that we are living in, is why there are no people protesting here, but only their shoes. That had to do with the fact that there was a terror attack in Paris in 2015, and public space was still was still under threat. And so people were advised to not go out, to not leave their homes, and to not put their bodies in public space. And even though this lecture today is not about securitization, I think this is very much part of the territory of site specificity, how bodies can actually or cannot inhabit public space at this moment in time. And now I'm moving to what I have announced to reflect and invite the question, how can we think about care in architecture? So because historically, as we all know, care has not, architecture has not been called a care profession. When we think of care professions, we might think of nurses in hospitals, or we might think of teachers, but we don't necessarily think of architects or urban planners. So is architecture then a form of care? How to think, practice, build, and write architecture as care? The following reflections are owed to my growing concern that architecture today, very much dominated by the form follows capital mantra, has to be more fully understood as a care practice. A closer look reveals that there is virtually no limit to care in architecture. This includes architecture in all its different phases and stages, from the organization of shared work in an architectural office. Just think that most architects still work from 8 to midnight or even longer, and also have very brutal conditions when it, not all of them, I mean I'm generalizing, but a lot of architectural practices are based on a work ethos that is very extremely demanding and is not very much geared to what we call a work-life balance. The organization of shared work in an architectural office to the completion of a building, from interactions with clients and contractors to labor conditions on construction sites, from considerations of material flows in architecture to maintaining or repairing existing buildings, from educating future architects to writing about architecture. So we can see that to practice architecture as a form of care really involves all the stages of architecture. And of course also what I haven't included here, once an architectural object is completed, there's a lot of caretaking necessary to maintain it as architecture that is useful for humans and non-humans. Yet historically, there has been a separation between architecture and care, structured around the axis of gendered, symbolic, political, and knowledge power, and its concomitant division of labor. Since care is crucial for architecture in all its manifestations, it's important to gain a critical understanding why architecture was historically separated from the labors of care. And I think that this process is deeply rooted in the binary system of traditional Western thought with its cultural, epistemological, material, philosophical, political, social, and technical consequences of organizing difference. As we all know, it's nothing new, I'm just repeating. This structure of gender hierarchy which devalued its feminine part. Such care provided through architecture is indispensable to human life and survival. Despite this obvious care function, and we might go and read Alberti, and then we see that this is very much described there, that the first and primary function of architecture is actually shelter, so to provide care from, and then he talks about the weather. So he talks about the climate. So things that when we transfer them over centuries to our time actually take on a very urgent meaning. Despite this obvious care function of protecting humans from sun, wind, snow, or rain, and giving the support necessary for the vital functions of everyday living, what is also called reproduction, architecture has been firmly associated with autonomy and not with dependency. Unlike other binary oppositions like nature, culture, private, public, or reproduction, production, the architecture-care divide has never been named as such. And this is something I'm very interested in and have been thinking about a lot and try to understand better. So it's not that I would claim this is in any way a finished project I'm talking about, for two reasons. A, I think it needs more research, and B, I think such a way of thinking can never be finished. It opens a way of thinking that makes actually political and very concrete real demands as how one has to remain invested in contributing to thinking architecture as a changed and transformative care practice. So that's what I'm trying to contribute to, introducing a critical care perspective in architecture and urbanism. And I'm quoting here and sharing this with you one definition of care provided by Berenice Fischer and Joan Tronto. Joan Tronto is a political scientist and professor at the University of Minnesota, and Berenice Fischer is no longer alive. But in 1990, they together authored an essay in which they provided this very broad definition of care. And precisely because it's so broad, it's actually useful to architecture and urbanism. On the most general level, we suggest that caring be viewed as a species activity that includes everything that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world. And I think we might want to substitute the word planet here. We can, I mean, we don't have to, but it's a way of thinking about this, so that we can live as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex life-sustaining web. And I think that this definition is extremely useful to think about architecture as a care practice, bringing together our bodies, ourselves, and the environment. They also, Joan Tronto in 2013 in one of her more recent publications on care and democracy also gave a register of the different parts that have to come together when we think about care. So caring about meaning to be attentive as to what we care about, caring for assuming responsibility as to what needs to be taken care of. Caregiving, she writes a lot about the skills and competencies that are required for that. And then she also speaks about, and she speaks a lot more about these one-to-one care situations. So when we think about housing or the built environment, the house itself as a structure of care has, of course, very many one-to-one relations with its users or inhabitants. But it's not necessarily a one-to-one relation between the architect and the person who uses this building. While she talks a lot about people in care situations, like in hospitals, who have really one-to-one relationships. And she talks about the hierarchies and the questions between caregiving and care receiving, and also the competencies and skills. She doesn't use the word competence. She used the word knowing in care receiving. I added the competence. But I think it's very important that she here speaks about responsiveness. So how those who are cared for respond to the care they receive. And this is not an evaluation-centric or success measuring or, tick the box kind of responsiveness. I don't know if you have followed the most recent reflections by Grabner, the Occupy activist. So I tried to bring those two together. But he used to be a professor in Yale, and he's now a professor at the London School of Economics. And he has written precisely about the fact that within care professions, like nurses, have to spend so much time in filling in forms that they actually don't have time to do the care they are supposed to do anymore. And that this bureaucratic complex eats up care practices. And that's why I think it's extremely important when we think about architecture and the built environment to not think in evaluation-centric ways, but about the way that responsiveness as a care practice can actually be achieved by way of architectural competencies, means, and tools. And now finally, I'm moving to the last part, in a curatorial work that is a long-term curatorial project that started in 2017, where Angelika Fitz and I worked at a site in Vienna, the Nordbahnhof, a former railway territory, which one could also refer to as a brown site. And we used the Nordbahnhalle, so a former warehouse, for an exhibition, and invited architects, 6 internationally practicing architects, to team up with local experts who were non-architects. So they might have been a care worker, a bird expert, a biologist, an activist, who then worked on site to develop new care prototypes or care practices on this territory. We started out with care walks, so to do walks with people who joined the walk. These groups were fairly large, 50 to 60 people coming, and I handed out quotes that came from the book by Tronto that I use very much to think about architecture and urbanism as a care practice. And then we used these quotes to identify sites on site in order to find out what kind of care practices and competencies might be needed there. And those of you who are not familiar with the site, I'm just showing very few images of what will be the so-called freie Mitte, so the center that will remain unbuilt upon, and this is the former warehouse, and what this urban transformation site will be like. One of the teams that we invited was Zisis Kotionis and Phoebe Giannisi, and they worked on a project called Nature Culture Calling, in which they tried to bring together birds and humans on this site. So the Nordbahnhof is extremely rich in different, not only plants, but also animals and birds. And they installed new bird houses, but also new sites for humans to be under these bird houses. And then they also did a large performative work in which they brought, because they worked together with this bird expert. So the bird expert can actually speak like birds. He can do all these bird sounds. And then the 2 practitioners from Greece, they brought into this bird sound that he performed as part of this public choir, Aristophanes' birds, which is very much a Greek political, so a very political antique play. And so they tried to bridge between humans that seek to get closer to an understanding of what nature today is, but also activate knowledge that has been part of, let's say, a human archive or reservoir of knowing that once upon many centuries ago has been called birds. And what is still in the future is this exhibition that we will open at the Architecture Center in Vienna in April, called Critical Care, which is, of course, in a way referencing what critical care means literally. So you have to go to critical care when you're not in a very good situation. But also that care is critical because of the state our planet finds itself in, which has to do what humans as a species have produced as their habitat on this planet. This will be the book published on the occasion of the exhibition, also coming out in April with MIT Press. And I'm very happy to share with you that Joan Tronto has written a new essay in which, for the first time in her work on care, she also tried to look at architecture as a profession. So I'm very happy that this will be part of the essays in there. And there will be 20 international practices, architectural practices, both physical architecture, so like long-term building infrastructures, but also practitioners of architecture who use the competencies and skills and way of thinking of architecture to do things that go beyond the built environment. And one of these examples is Anna Heringer. Many of you might have seen that. It was also included in the Architecture Biennale in Venice, the one that is still on currently. Anna Heringer is an architect who has worked in the context of Bangladesh for many years. She has done some very beautiful schools there where she uses clay as a material. Many of you might have seen them published. They were widely published. But she has also collaborated with Bangladeshi women. And when we think about textiles made in Bangladesh, we think of cheap labor, and we think of collapsing infrastructure, of very exploitative and dangerous work conditions. And so what she has been setting up together with local Bangladeshi women is this enterprise called Didi Textiles. Typically, women in Bangladesh buy, rural women in Bangladesh, as is explained by Anna Heringer, buy one new sari every year. And then those saris, as long as they are no longer really worn, they become reused in many different ways, but mostly for textiles that have to do with the domestic interior, such as blankets or pillows. Here she has worked with the women to transform these used saris, to upcycle them for not only the global south, but a lot more the global north. So they will be sold at a very fair price in the context of the global north. This is where we see working conditions as they are at the moment when women work together. And this is also part of what this project aspires to be. So to build new infrastructures. At the moment, everything is sewn by hand, and to also acquire Singer sewing machines. I'm doing this because they want this kind of sewing machine where you use your foot to actually move it. And the very last image I'm showing you is what you can already buy when you go on the Didi Textiles website. So I'm not a fan of marketing or product placement, neither in movies nor in lectures. But I'm doing this. But in this case, I'm doing this because I think it's a very not just interesting, but it is one of these examples that set a precedence how long-term shifting of sites and rethinking how transnational sites are connected in flows of labor, materials, but also sharing of infrastructures and knowledge actually come together. And I want to conclude with a quote by Bruno Latour. Usually when it's a question of paying attention to oneself, to one's own survival, to the well-being of those we care about, we tend rather to err in the direction of security. And here he talks, for example, about that children are no longer allowed to play in public space, or that there is constant digital surveillance of all kinds of humans, young and old, in order to care about them. But there's also an element of control, most certainly, as Foucault has written about at great length. But then I continue with Latour. The overly celebrated precautionary principle is applied abundantly as soon as it's a matter of protecting our surroundings and our belongings. Now, for this worldwide crisis, no one invokes the precautionary principle in order to plunge bravely into action. This time, this humanity has remained passive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elke. Before we go into Q&As, if there are any questions, I wanted to mention Benjamin Nelson's sound installation, which you might have heard. Maybe you have wondered what was going on. It's called Aviary. Would you like to say a few words about it, or not?
Yeah, it'll be going throughout the day. I don't know, maybe hopefully it's not too disruptive, but more adds something to the space while we're in here. And yeah, it's sort of our birds for the day, I guess.
Thank you. It was well fitting to the lecture.
Yeah, it was nice to hear it. I tried to listen to it, but then I don't know, I really need to focus. It was very nice to have the sound.
So Elke will have to leave before the roundtable because she has another engagement. So if you have questions about the concept or the exhibition, it would be probably good to ask now. You can ask in German or English, Italian, maybe French, we'll try. So let us know if there are any questions.
You briefly mentioned clay as a material when you talked about unwebbing. Will you also look into things like adobe architecture, Lehmarchitektur? I was very struck by this when we were traveling recently on a field trip, because there it's a different concept of a building which is not finished but which is constantly being repaired and cared for and looked after, and I found this very fascinating.
Yeah, we'll have examples of that, but not necessarily only, because I think it's very dangerous when we think about architecture as a care practice, to then say it's just adobe or it's just clay. So I would be that's why I would have been very hesitant to just go this way. I think that it's crucial to think about all kinds of materials in architecture as those that need a radical care perspective. But definitely, we will have Kundu's work in one of her works. She has worked with clay as a material, even though she's also an architect who very strongly speaks out about not wanting architects in the global south to be reduced to clay as a material. So I think there's this tension that a lot of the things when we talk about care in architecture embody this kind of tension of devaluation or feminization or the risk of becoming minoritized or something like that.
Jeanette Pacher.
Elke, I thought, I was wondering, could you give a more concrete example of what you understand of caretaking in architecture? What is it? Does it apply more to the way a house or an urban area would be laid out for, sort of having in mind how people will then use it, or yeah.
So I think that all falls into this, but I think I think about this, let's say, when spatially on a meta level. So to conceive of architecture as a practice of care, and that would mean that the way we think about the labor conditions in the materials that are used in architecture, the way houses can be either maintained or repaired, but also newly built urban infrastructures and houses. So it's more about a perspective than any one typology. I would say it's an ethical and political perspective of doing architecture. And as we all know, architecture is one of the practices that is always entangled with regimes of power. And it's an extremely money-intensive practice. So not only with political power, but also with economic power. And therefore, it's never outside of any kind of system, but we could say it's always a support structure, regardless what the system is. And so I would argue for a care perspective as practicing what we then call architecture, that is the result of it, but taking into account the process of production just as much as what then is actually produced. And it would include all the things you were saying, I mean, like housing, urban environments, infrastructures. I hope it was.
Are there any other questions? Any?
I'm okay. I mean, I don't know if it's as prevalent a practice in Europe as it is in the US, but I mean, in recent years there's been a lot of talk about basically anti-homelessness and hostile architecture becoming a major practice. Has this been part of your research as well, or part of your exhibition?
Like these benches that you cannot lie down on? That's the kind of
benches
yeah.
you can't lie down on, making it so people physically can't sleep in doorways or alleys and this type of thing.
So I think there has been a lot on that, and I'm personally more interested in things that actually show things that are possible in a positive way, so that might sound a little kitschy, but I think exhibitions are challenged with anti. I mean, if you are against something and you exhibit it, you're still affirming it because you're exhibiting it. So that's not really an answer to your question, but in a certain way, I wouldn't want a collection of hostile architecture that then comes under the rubric of care. I'd rather show 20 examples that seek to practice a caring perspective and then apply this precisely to what you were saying. So to understand how there can be active hostility practiced through architecture, but I would say the absence of care in architecture is not necessarily always intentional. But I think what you are referring to is something that very intentionally uses architecture as a power tool to make life for people worse or more miserable, or to take away public space or access. So maybe I can quote Muff, a British architectural practice based in London, and they say access should be the gorgeous norm. So not something that is the exception, but something that is actually, as they are saying, the gorgeous norm. And I think this would be a very good, let's say, quote to counteract precisely these hostile and uninviting infrastructures that you were talking about.
Any other questions? All right, then let's give Elke another round of applause.